Randy Kraft is one of the most sadistic and organized serial killers in U.S. history. Active between 1971 and 1983, Kraft is believed to have killed at least 67 young men, though the actual number could be higher. His methodical approach, cryptic, scorecard, and horrific torture techniques set him apart from other serial murderers. His arrest in 1983 revealed a chilling glimpse into his calculated brutality, exposing a man who had maintained a double life of professional success and personal stability while committing some of the most gruesome murders ever recorded. Born in 1945, Kraft grew up in a strict household in California. A bright student, he excelled academically and later attended Claremont McKenna College, where he studied economics. However, it was during this time that his darker impulses began to emerge. By the late 1960s, Kraft had come to terms with his homosexuality, but rather than embracing it openly, he hid behind a facade of normalcy. His secret life as a predator started taking shape, and his victims were soon chosen with a disturbing level of precision. Kraft's victims were primarily young men, often hitchhikers, Marines, or individuals leaving bars late at night. Unlike some killers who acted on impulse, Kraft meticulously planned his abductions. His targets were usually those who appeared vulnerable, drunk, alone, or in need of a ride. Once inside his car, Kraft would offer them alcohol laced with sedatives, rendering them helpless. What followed was a prolonged and horrific ordeal, as Kraft derived pleasure from their suffering before finally ending their lives. Investigators discovered that Kraft kept a secret scorecard, a list of cryptic entries that appeared to document his victims. Some of these names included Marine Head, Angel, and Jail Out. Each phrase was believed to correspond to a different murder, though many remain unidentified. This disturbing record of his crimes suggested that Kraft saw his killings as achievements, something to be noted, remembered, and counted. The full extent of his crimes remains unknown, as many bodies have never been recovered. The murder of Michael Ray Schlicht was one of the many tragic cases linked to Kraft. Schlicht, a 20-year-old Marine, vanished under suspicious circumstances before his body was later discovered. His case bore chilling similarities to Kraft's other victims. He had been drugged, tortured, and strangled. Like many of Kraft's victims, Schlicht had no idea of the horror that awaited him when he crossed paths with the killer. His name, like so many others, was likely recorded in Kraft's infamous scorecard. Kraft's signature style of murder involved extreme sadism. Many of his victims were found with burn marks, mutilated genitals, or signs of extended torture. Some were forced to ingest lethal amounts of drugs or alcohol before being strangled. The level of brutality inflicted upon these men suggested that Kraft derived immense pleasure from their suffering. This psychological need to control, humiliate, and destroy his victims made him one of the most feared serial killers of his time. Despite his long killing spree, Kraft managed to evade law enforcement for over a decade. Part of this was due to the geographical spread of his crimes. Bodies were found in multiple states, making it difficult for investigators to connect the cases. Additionally, forensic technology was still developing, and databases were not yet centralized. These factors allowed Kraft to continue killing, undetected, for years. However, his reign of terror finally came to an end on May 14, 1983. While driving on the San Diego freeway, Kraft was pulled over for erratic driving. Inside his car, officers found a young man dead, his body still warm. Further searches revealed drugs, bloodstains, and a disturbing collection of photographs. But the most damning piece of evidence was Kraft's infamous scorecard, which would soon help link him to dozens of unsolved murders. The arrest marked the beginning of one of the most chilling murder investigations in American history. The layers of Kraft's double life were peeled away, revealing a man who had lived among society unnoticed, all while committing some of the most gruesome crimes imaginable. The investigation into his past would lead to shocking discoveries, including potential victims who had never been reported missing. Kraft's trial was a lengthy and highly publicized affair. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including fiber analysis, blood stains, and the detailed entries in his scorecard. The jury was left horrified by the extent of his crimes, and after years of legal proceedings, Kraft was sentenced to death in 1989. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to maintain his innocence. Despite this, investigators firmly believe he was responsible for far more murders than those officially linked to him. Even decades after his arrest, the case of Randy Kraft continues to haunt the families of his victims. Many remain unidentified, and the full extent of his crimes may never be known. His case serves as a chilling reminder of the hidden darkness that can lurk behind a seemingly normal facade. Kraft's ability to lead a double life, working as a successful computer consultant while secretly committing heinous acts, makes him one of the most terrifying serial killers in modern history. Ray Schlicht was one of the many young men who unknowingly crossed paths with Randy Kraft, sealing his tragic fate. At 20-year-old U.S. Marine, Schlicht represented the type of victim Kraft frequently targeted: young, strong, and seemingly invulnerable. However, like so many others before him, Schlicht became ensnared in Kraft's twisted world, where deception, torture, and death awaited. Schlicht had been stationed in Southern California, an area where Kraft was known to hunt. Many of Kraft's victims were Marines or military personnel who had been out drinking, hitchhiking, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Schlicht was last seen leaving a bar near his base, a common hunting ground for Kraft. It is believed that the killer lured Schlicht into his vehicle, offering him a ride or alcohol, perhaps both. Once inside, the young Marine was at Kraft's mercy. Kraft's pattern of killing was methodical. He subdued his victims with alcohol or tranquilizers before engaging in extended torture. In Schlicht's case, investigators found evidence of ligature marks and other wounds indicating prolonged suffering. Like many others, Schlicht's body was dumped in a remote area, discarded without any remorse. The medical examination showed he had been strangled, likely after enduring unimaginable pain. Schlicht's name was believed to be among the coded entries on Kraft's infamous scorecard, a disturbing ledger of death. This cryptic document contained shorthand references to each victim, often using inside jokes or clues only Kraft understood. Investigators speculated that the scorecard was a way for him to relive his crimes, turning human lives into mere notations on a list. Though Schlicht's entry remains uncertain, his death fits Kraft's known patterns too precisely to be coincidental. What makes Schlicht's murder particularly chilling is how easily Kraft continued his killing spree afterward. Law enforcement at the time had little forensic technology to connect crimes spanning multiple counties and states. This allowed Kraft to evade suspicion, blending back into his respectable life after each brutal slaying. Schlicht's case, like many others, was initially unsolved. It wasn't until Kraft's arrest in 1983 that authorities began linking the pieces together. The overwhelming evidence from Kraft's car and home, including photos and bloodstains, tied him to multiple murders. However, due to the sheer number of victims and the time that had passed, definitive proof in Schlicht's case remained elusive. To this day, Schlicht's family, like many others, is left with unanswered questions. The brutality of his death, the senseless nature of his murder, and the knowledge that he was just one of many in Kraft's reign of terror remain deeply unsettling. His story is a tragic reminder of how predators like Kraft operate in the shadows, striking when least expected. One of the most haunting aspects of Randy Kraft's crimes is the infamous scorecard, a cryptic list of more than 60 coded entries that appeared to correspond to his victims. Found in Kraft's vehicle at the time of his arrest, this document became one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in criminal history. Investigators soon realized that each vague phrase was a disturbing reference to a life lost. The entries included labels like Marine Head, Parking Lot, 2-in-1 Beach, and Angel, each hinting at details of a particular murder. While many entries remain unsolved, law enforcement successfully linked several of them to known victims. Some references indicated locations where bodies were found, while others hinted at the victim's occupations or physical traits. The case of Michael Ray Schlicht is believed to be on this list, though the exact corresponding phrase remains uncertain. Kraft's victims suffered extensively before death. Unlike many serial killers who sought quick executions, Kraft appeared to take pleasure in prolonged torment. Many bodies bore signs of intense torture: cigarette burns, deep cuts, and chemical burns. Some were found with objects forced into their bodies, while others were strangled only after hours of suffering. The level of sadism shocked even the most experienced investigators. One of the more disturbing revelations was Kraft's use of alcohol and drugs to subdue his victims. Many were found with lethal amounts of tranquilizers or painkillers in their systems. In some cases, they were force-fed large amounts of liquor, rendering them powerless before the abuse began. Kraft ensured his victims were defenseless, allowing him complete control over their fates. Despite the horrors of his crimes, Kraft maintained a respectable outward image. He had a long-term partner, held steady employment, and socialized with friends who had no idea of his dark double life. This ability to compartmentalize his actions made him even more dangerous. While others searched for an obvious monster, Kraft hid in plain sight, deceiving everyone around him. The scorecard ultimately became a critical piece of evidence in his trial. The prosecution used it to illustrate the scale of Kraft's crimes, proving that he was not only methodical, but took pride in his actions. While Kraft denied responsibility, the weight of the evidence, including bloodstains, fibers, and photographic evidence, left no doubt. Though he was convicted for 16 murders, authorities believe Kraft's true victim count is far higher. Many entries on the scorecard remain unsolved, and additional bodies may never be identified. His ability to travel across multiple states and dump bodies in isolated areas left countless cases unresolved. Some believe his actual number of victims could be well over 100. Decades later, Kraft remains on death row, showing no remorse. His case continues to haunt forensic experts, reminding the world of the terrifying cunning of a man who turned murder into a twisted game. Richard Keith, a 20-year-old Marine, was stationed at El Toro Marine Base in California. Known for his discipline and dedication, he had a promising future ahead. However, on February 6, 1978, Keith mysteriously vanished without a trace. His sudden disappearance was alarming, as he was not someone prone to reckless behavior. Days later, his lifeless body was discovered along a freeway, sending shockwaves through his family and fellow Marines. The crime scene was horrific. Keith's wrists were bound, his body bore cigarette burns, bruises, and deep ligature marks, and he had been strangled to death. His injuries suggested that he had been held captive for hours, subjected to cruel and sadistic torture before his murder. At the time, authorities were grappling with a disturbing pattern. Young men, often hitchhikers or military personnel, were being found dead under eerily similar circumstances. Despite the apparent connections, investigators lacked the forensic tools to identify a single suspect, leaving Keith's case unresolved. It wasn't until 1983, when Randy Kraft was arrested, that investigators began to connect the dots. In Kraft's vehicle, police found a disturbing collection of photographs, notes, and coded messages. Among these was the infamous scorecard, a list of cryptic phrases believed to reference Kraft's many victims. One phrase stood out: Marine Head. Authorities suspected this referred to Keith, and further forensic examination revealed fibers from Kraft's car on Keith's clothing. During Kraft's trial, prosecutors presented the gruesome details of Keith's death. Though Kraft never confessed, the overwhelming evidence linked him to the murder. Keith's case played a crucial role in securing Kraft's conviction and eventual death sentence, ensuring justice for the young Marine who had once pledged his life to serving his country. Robert Wyatt Loggins was a 19-year-old young man with his whole life ahead of him. In 1974, he mysteriously disappeared, leaving his family desperate for answers. Days later, his body was found along a California freeway, discarded like so many other victims of the scene was disturbing. His wrists were bound, his body showed bruises, burns, and signs of strangulation, and it was clear he had suffered immensely before his death. At the time, police had no leads. They suspected that Loggins, like many others, may have accepted a ride from a stranger before his murder. The pattern was chilling. Young men, many of them hitchhikers, were vanishing, only to be found later in similar conditions. However, forensic technology in the 1970s was limited and no solid suspect emerged. The case went cold, leaving his family heartbroken and without closure. 9 years later, in 1983, authorities arrested Randy Kraft, uncovering his sinister scorecard, a coded list of victims he had killed. Among the cryptic entries was one that simply read, Loggins. Investigators immediately suspected this referred to Robert Wyatt Loggins. The torture methods matched Kraft's known pattern, and Loggins's disappearance aligned with Kraft's active killing spree. Though Kraft never admitted guilt, the mounting evidence left little doubt. Prosecutors presented Loggins' case at trial, showing how his brutal death fit Kraft's established pattern. While his family never received a confession, Kraft's conviction brought some measure of justice. Loggins' case became another tragic reminder of Randy Kraft's monstrous crimes. The arrest of Randy Kraft on May 14, 1983, marked the end of one of the most chilling murder sprees in American history. The discovery of his scorecard, along with overwhelming forensic evidence, ensured his conviction. However, even decades later, the true scale of his crimes remains a mystery. His arrest not only brought justice to some of his victims, but also changed the way law enforcement approached serial murder cases. At the time of Kraft's crimes, DNA analysis and forensic databases were in their infancy. This allowed him to operate undetected for years, with cases spread across multiple jurisdictions. Authorities often struggled to connect the murders, as bodies were found across different counties and states. Many victims were misidentified as accidental overdoses or unrelated homicides. It wasn't until Kraft's arrest, with evidence found directly in his car, that the full scope of his actions became clear. His trial, which began in 1988, became one of the most complex murder cases ever prosecuted. With 16 confirmed victims, the prosecution presented thousands of pieces of evidence, from fiber analysis to his handwritten kill list. Kraft's calm demeanor in court was unsettling. He showed no emotion, no remorse, and continued to maintain his innocence. Despite this, the jury sentenced him to death in 1989. One of the major legacies of the Kraft case was the emphasis on interjurisdictional collaboration. Law enforcement agencies realized that serial killers often operated across vast areas, and better communication between departments was necessary. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, was expanded to track patterns in murders, preventing future cases from slipping through the cracks. The advancements in forensic science since Kraft's conviction have also led to new developments. Some previously unidentified victims have been named through DNA testing, while others remain cold cases. Investigators continue to compare evidence from his known crimes to unsolved murders, hoping to close more cases. Kraft's psychological profile has also been heavily studied. Unlike some serial killers, he showed no early warning signs of violence. He was intelligent, well-liked, and held a steady job. This challenges traditional ideas about serial offenders, proving that even the most outwardly normal individuals can hide unimaginable darkness. Decades later, Kraft remains on California's death row, appealing his sentence. His case continues to haunt criminal psychologists, forensic experts, and the families of his victims. While justice has been served, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. His story serves as a grim reminder of the dangers lurking beneath seemingly ordinary lives.